Morning to everyone joining us. Lovely to see you today. A very warm welcome to you all. Um, just some intro. So I'm Jenny Beresford-Jones. I'm a Senior Legal Advisor, Procurement Specialist in the team here at Mills and Reeve. I'm here today with Shailee Howard. Shailee is the partner who leads our procurement practice here. And perhaps more importantly, though, she's responsible really for baking within the procurement team, um, including organising our procurement portal cupcakes, which had great reviews at our recent events. And also for her first outing today on 5 and 25, we have Nathalia Perera. Nathalia joined us as a principal associate last year from a background in both the public sector and in private practice, and also with a very poorly concealed passion for all things procurement. So that meant she fitted in straight away. She tries to hide it, but we know it's there. And of course, together with the rest of the team, we act for suppliers and authorities on a whole range of procurement projects, from pre-market engagement, procurement processes, contract management, disputes and challenges. And we're now into 3 months into the life of the Procurement Act. So I hope everybody is enjoying the ride, holding on tight. It has been a really fascinating time, as well as needing quite a lot of mental flexibility, I think, to live in two worlds at the same time, the PCRs and the Act, thanks to the transitional provisions. Um, so again, just to reiterate, a warm welcome to everybody who has joined. In terms of housekeeping, the session's been recorded, and also the slides and a copy of the recording will be circulated after the event. So do look out for those. We really welcome your legal questions. Put those in the Q&A box. We won't deal with those in the session itself, but we'll come back to you with a Q&A document as usual. And again, if you've got technical issues, again, put that note in the Q&A box, and Sarah, who is looking after the technical side, will try and help you. So today we're not homing in on the Act, and we'll do that next time, but I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that the deadline for authorities to publish their pipeline notices is the 26th of May, which is next Monday, so double exclamation mark there. Hopefully everybody is fully aware and up to speed, but in case not, there are some details on this slide. So essentially, if you're planning to spend over 100,000 in the coming financial year on goods, services or works, and that includes your below threshold contracts, your direct awards, you need to publish one of these pipeline notices, and that's a notice for each contract valued at over 2 million in the next 18 months, where you're planning to publish either a tender notice to run a competition or a transparency notice if you're making a direct award. It's not mandatory for call-offs, but it's recommended as best practice if your call-off is over 2 million. And we have got some guidance, the official guidance there, which was updated last week to confirm that you do need a separate notice for each contract. And if the Act and the regulations and the guidance on the templates weren't enough, there's also now leaflets, and there's a leaflet on pipeline notices. I'm sure there'll be more of those in due course. And it does look like most authorities are really on it. 1,500 notices published so far, 452 just on Monday and Tuesday of this week. So people really are getting into gear with that. So, as I said, we thought we would have a bit of a mini break away from the Act and talk about procurement cases this time, which has been a bit neglected, and understandably so, because everybody's been so busy with the implementation of the Act. So, when we were thinking about that, the first question that came to mind was, well, now we've got the Act, what does that mean for all of our favourite procurement law cases and concepts, such as the R1 tenderer, manifest error, and so on? And foolishly, I put my hand up to try and answer that question, and it was a bit foolish because it's quite complex. But anyway, I've done my best. And I thought we needed to start at the very beginning in order to understand what's happened to procurement law recently. And of course, that's, as we know from The Sound of Music, is a very good place to start. So what we used to have was an EU directive on public procurement, and that was implemented here by way of some regulations, and that was our old friends, the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. And member states were able to choose how they implemented the directive within reason. And in here in the UK, we went for the most straightforward and pragmatic approach called the copy out approach, which is we took the wording of the directive and we just copied it out effectively into the PCRs. And that directive ceased to bind the UK in January 2020 when we left the EU. But the PCRs were on our domestic statute books and they continued there with very little alteration until February of this year, when of course they were revoked in favour of the Act. And of course, as we all know, the Act was passed by Parliament and then it came into force on 24th of February. And various regulations have been made under it, and most significantly, the Procurement Regulations 2024, which contain lots of detail about notices and so on. So what does that mean for our favourite procurement law cases? Well, any EU case law that was in existence as at the 31st of January 2020 is called retained EU law, and the courts will follow that unless and until the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court chooses to do something differently. Of course, the PCRs have been enforced until very recently, and due to the copy-out approach that I talked about earlier, they pretty much mirrored the EU directive. So that really has meant that it made sense for the courts to use EU case law to decide how to approach PCR cases even after 2020. It's meaning that not much has really changed, even though Brexit has happened. However, if we look at the Act, the language is really quite different. And there are some EU concepts that don't necessarily sit all that well with the language of the Act. And there's a few examples on the slide there. So manifest error, R1 tenderer, economic operator, those concepts are not in the Act. And indeed, those principles of transparency, equal treatment and non-discrimination do have a particular sort of EU meaning and are not necessarily set out in quite the same way in the Act. And then added to that, the Act has made a real effort to bring in some UK concepts. So the concept of a connected person, for example, that has its roots in the Companies Act. And the concept of acting with integrity in Section 12 is an English law concept. So I think that means we can see that the courts might suddenly might decide that they need to begin to move away from the approaches taken historically in case law, particularly where the language and the concepts have diverged. And that will leave the judges having to fall back, I think, on rules of judicial interpretation, which we learn at law school, essentially ascribing a common sense meaning to the language and aiming to reflect the intention of the legislators of Parliament. And I think overall, the previous case law will continue to be a good guide, and the courts are not likely to depart from it in the absence of anything better, unless there's a really good reason to do so. And you've got to ask really which judge would be brave enough to rewrite the R1 tenderer test or to take a different view on manifest error. I certainly wouldn't put my hand up for that role. And just on that, I think it hands over to Shailee, who's going to talk to us about the Optima case. And I think some of those EU concepts come up in that.
So I'm going to look at the recent Court of Appeal judgment in the case of Optima and the Department for Work and Pensions. It's not very often that we get procurement cases that go all the way up to the Court of Appeal. So this caused much excitement amongst the procurement legal community. The case concerned a contract for occupational health and employee assistant programme services. It was conducted by DWP and it was a call-off from a CCS framework agreement by way of mini competition. I think what that demonstrates is that there remains a risk of legal challenge even when you are calling off from a framework agreement. You'll also remember that we had the case of Consultant Connect a while ago, which was all to do with the way in which NHS trusts had called off from a framework agreement. Anyway, back to the current case. I think what's clear from both the High Court judgment and the Court of Appeal judgment is that the procurement was really beset with difficulties from the outset, something that Lord Justice Coulson in the Court of Appeal judgment described as the unhappy history of the procurement. The original tenders were submitted in March 2022, but due to various issues with the pricing schedule, there were no less than 4 pricing schedules submitted, the last of which was in March 2023, with the evaluation then taking place in May 2023. It does make you wonder what happened to that tender validity period, but anyway, that's by the by. Under the terms of the CCS framework, it was clear that suppliers couldn't charge prices that were in excess of those prices that were set out in the framework agreement. And that's something that you do quite commonly see in the terms of framework agreements. And that was the case here. In the process run by DWP, Optima submitted a pricing schedule where a small number of the items in the pricing schedule were indeed in excess of the framework prices, and that was later found to be due to a clerical error. But at the time, DWP reviewed that, considered Optima's tender to be non-compliant and excluded its tender. And I think what was really interesting here is that had Optima not included these so-called non-compliant prices, it would have comfortably been the winning bid, as it had the highest score on the quality weighting, which was some 95%. So Optima challenged their disqualification, and there were two issues that were at dispute at the Court of Appeal stage. The first was whether the invitation to tender documents clearly and transparently set out the consequences of a tenderer exceeding the framework prices. And the second issue was whether DWP ought to have permitted Optima to correct or clarify the errors in its tender. So looking at the first issue, which you've got on the slide there, the tender document said that any prices submitted in excess of the framework prices will be discounted. And the court considered that concept of the R-wine tenderer, the reasonably well-informed and normally diligent tenderer, and considered whether the R-wine tenderer would have understood this to mean that this would render its bid non-compliant and therefore would be disqualified. And the Court of Appeal said no, an R-wine tenderer would not have come to that conclusion because there was no reference to exclusion or disqualification like there was in other parts of the ITT. And the court spent some time discussing the meaning of the word discounted. And could it mean reduced? So could it mean that actually the authority were going to reduce those prices to the maximum framework price or excluded? In the end, the court concluded that the wording in the ITT was wholly incapable of providing the clarity and transparency that was required of any exclusion provision. And I think what this demonstrates is the importance of clear tender documents and confirms that the concept of the R-wine tenderer lives on. We work with lots of authorities that are carefully constructing their evaluation methodologies to ensure that they can identify a clear winner who meets their requirements. And a good way of doing that is by having very clear pass-fail requirements. And I think what this case demonstrates is that those pass-fail requirements and the consequences of them must be clearly set out in the procurement documents. And in that case, in this case rather, had the authority used consistent language throughout in relation to exclusion, there could potentially have been a different outcome. And if you're a supplier, I think it's worth thinking about whether it's worth seeking clarification of any ambiguous terms in the procurement documents when you receive them, particularly if they relate to the authority's right to exclude. On the second issue, Optima claimed that there was a duty to clarify those particular line items in the pricing submission. There's quite a good description of the various EU and UK cases on the duty to seek clarification, which is worth a read if you have some time. But effectively, the court identified three stages to be considered by an authority. Stage number one is that the need to seek clarification should only arise where the error or ambiguity is obvious to the contracting authority and material to the outcome of the procurement. And here, I think it was clear from the evidence that the errors in the pricing spreadsheet were indeed clerical errors. The overall effect on the price was a mere £600, which was 0.02% of the pricing evaluation. And indeed, there was evidence from the authority that described the errors as clerical sort of cut and paste errors. Stage two, where the error or ambiguity is obvious, then the authority has a discretion whether to seek clarification, and whether that discretion turns into an obligation to clarify will turn on the facts of the case. But in any case, the authority should choose the least onerous option. And so what that means is that if there is a choice between seeking clarification or excluding from the procurement, then the authority should seek clarification in that scenario. And finally, stage three if a tenderer is asked to provide clarification, there is limited room for manoeuvre insofar that the clarification cannot result in substantial amendments or indeed a submission of a new bid, which is very much an established part of case law. And the court said that a common sense approach should be taken. So experienced evaluators should generally know when a response to a request for clarification is a simple adjustment of the kind that they generally expected, or whether it's an attempt to effectively have another go at the bid. So therefore, it's still really important for authorities to carefully consider clarifications on a case-by-case basis, especially in circumstances where there's an error or an obvious ambiguity that's likely to affect the outcome of the procurement. So I think, again, a useful reminder on when to seek a clarification from this case. Right, I will hand on to Nathalia.
Thank you, Shailee, and good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yep. Okay. So thanks very much. We are going to talk about a case which is from the Scottish PCRs, a Scottish light touch case. So it's not binding, but it will be of interest to you. And the rules on lotting under the Procurement Act are actually very similar to the rules under the PCRs. So facts of the case. Glasgow City Council was procuring homelessness support services with a total value of £74 million split across 6 lots. Now, the lotting rules in the ITT were as follows. Bidders could bid for lots 2, 3, or 4, which were geographically based. They could bid for all lots, but if they bid for lots 2, 3, or 4, they also had to bid for lot 5, which was going to end up as a multi-supplier lot. They could bid for any number of lots. They could only win one of lots 1 to 4. They could win 3 lots overall, and they had to set out their order of preference. Now, the ITT also contains some wording which we've put on the slide, saying that if a bidder was to be successful in more than one lot, their preference would be considered in lot allocation where that did not result in a lot being unfilled. Therefore, preference was not guaranteed. And also, the council reserved the right to amalgamate lots or to award more than one lot to one provider to avoid any lots being unfilled. So those are the facts. Let's move on to the next slide. So what happened? Turning Point, the claimant, submitted 3 bids, lot 3, lot 4, which was its preference, and lot 6. And on evaluation, Turning Point was actually the only bidder for lot 3, so it had submitted the most economically advantageous tender. Turning Point also submitted the most economically advantageous tender for lot 4, but on contract award, the council awarded lot 3 to Turning Point and lot 4 to the second place bidder, the Salvation Army, who scored 10% less than Turning Point. So Turning Point challenged this. Firstly, they didn't complain about the transparency of the rules set out in the ITT. In any case, such a claim would have been time barred because it's more than 30 days since they'd seen that rule in the ITT. What they did complain about was that awarding lot 4 to the Salvation Army was an unlawful exercise of discretion. So they were saying, hey, just because we were the only bidder for lot 3, we lost out on lot 4, which was our preference, where we were the first place bidder. I think you can have sympathy for that argument. And so they also said that that is not what an R-Wines tenderer would have understood from the ITT, and therefore the authority was not exercising its discretion correctly. So in its defence, the council said, no, we're doing what we said we would do in the ITT. We had a rule about the maximum number of lots a bidder could win. We never guaranteed preference. And this is the really crucial bit, our discretion to amalgamate lots or to award more than one lot to a bidder was to avoid any lots being unfilled. So their argument was that any reasonably well-informed and normally diligent tenderer would have understood that the council didn't have to exercise their discretion because there wasn't a risk of the lot being unfilled. Now, the council also noted it had policy reasons for limiting the number of lots a bidder could win, and it talked about reducing barriers to entry and securing market capacity. So how did the judgment fall? Well, spoiler, it's already on the slide. The court found in favour of the council. Now, there were some nuances here because this is a light touch regime, but ultimately, the court didn't have an issue with the second place bidder who didn't submit the most economically advantageous tender being awarded lot 4. And actually, the court found that the Arwines tender principle didn't even apply here and wasn't relevant because the transparency of the documents wasn't being challenged. However, the judge did comment that the ITT wasn't as transparent as it could have been on the rule around the maximum number of lots a bidder could win. So, what are the takeaways here? Let's put this in the context of the Procurement Act, where the lotting rules are quite similar. Under the Act, you have a duty to consider lots. So if you can lot and you don't lot, you have to say why in the tender notice. Having a lotting structure does tick your having regard to the barriers to SMEs box, and the court was supportive of the council's reasoning when they explained this as their reasoning for their lotting structure. So under the Act, you can limit how many lots a bidder can bid for, you can limit how many lots a bidder can win, and like the regs, and was crucial to the case, you must have an objective mechanism for situations where a supplier would exceed winning your number of maximum lots. So the key points for authorities here are you should be crystal clear on your lotting rules. If you have discretion, you must say when you will exercise it and how it will be exercised. You should also structure your rules on lotting really carefully, particularly on the interrelation between lots and the dependencies. So say how you're going to allocate the lots, in what order, what the consequences are, and what your reasoning is. And that's really important. And if you're a bidder, if you have an issue with the lotting rules, you should really complain within 30 days of seeing the ITT, because complaining about the award decision when an authority has already followed its rules is unlikely to be successful in that scenario. So that's a case of turning point in Glasgow City Council. Hand over to Jenny.
Thanks, Nathalia. That was a brilliant digest of a really complicated case. So thank you for that. Much appreciated. So the final case today is about healthcare services contracts under the provider selection regime, and it does have potential to be relevant to you if you are ever providing, for example, equipment services, works or IT services together with some sort of clinical service for patients. So just as a reminder before we look at the case, the Act on the one hand and the PSR on the other. So under the Procurement Act, obviously we have a contracting authority procuring goods, works or services. And those services do include some light touch regime health services, where that's in a non-NHS context. By contrast, though, the provider selection regime, or the PSR as it's known, is a separate set of rules, and these apply to the procurement by a relevant authority, so that's an ICB, a local authority or an NHS body, of a relevant health service for the purposes of the NHS. So essentially a clinical health service for NHS patients. So far so good. But what happens if your contract straddles both types of service? And I put some examples on the slide there on the right. So imagine a sort of IT health services contract, for example, for online sexual health counselling for young people. What about a contract where a provider arranges to build some premises and then to provide a clinical health service within that building? Or, for example, something like a managed equipment services contract that has a clinical element. So you're providing some kind of equipment like scans for doing radiography, but also some sort of clinical diagnostic services attached to that. And that's not to mention the potential impact of AI in the future and how that would fall into the mix of how clinical health services are delivered. So if you find yourself sort of straddling across both regimes, you have to apply what's called the mixed contracts test, and that's set out in the PSR. And if you can satisfy this test, then you can proceed under the PSR. And essentially, there's two questions you have to ask there. One is, what is the main subject matter of this contract? And is it healthcare services rather than other types of services? And the way you assess that is to look at the lifetime value of the healthcare services as against the non-healthcare services. But also, it's also important to show that you can't separate out the PSR and the non-PSR services into two separate contracts. So there's two elements of the test there. we've often seen a requirement that the provider has a Care Quality Commission registration as an indication that the service is a clinical health service, and that can certainly be a helpful indication. And anyway, why does this matter? Well, I think if it's the Act that applies rather than the PSR, so the mixed contracts test isn't met, the consequences are really quite significant. First of all, there's a lot less flexibility to make, for example, direct awards to incumbent providers under the Act than there is under the PSR, or to avoid having to run a competition. And secondly, the PSR doesn't really have the sort of remedies regime and court challenge process that we see under the Procurement Act. So the PSR has a lot more flexibility and potentially less risk of court challenge than the Act, and that means this sort of mixed contract analysis can be quite important. So in terms of the case, so this was a commissioning of orthotics and wheelchair services in the Midlands in Leicestershire. And in this case, that was it was a review by the independent panel whose role is to review PSR cases where there's been a complaint by a provider and make recommendations to the commissioner. So, as we said, here the commissioner was awarding a contract that covered orthotics and wheelchairs, and the wheelchairs were bespoke to each particular patient. And the commissioner was quite clear, yes, the orthotics, that's clearly a healthcare service, but what about the wheelchairs? Isn't this just a goods procurement, and shouldn't that fall under the Act rather than PSR? However, they applied the mixed contract test that we've just looked at, and they were happy that that was met. So they thought, yes, that's fine, we can proceed under the PSR. And in doing that, it already had a contract with an incumbent that it was really happy with. So they simply used the PSR direct award process C to make a direct award to that incumbent without any competition. And of course, there was a competitor supplier in the landscape who was sort of put out by this and challenged. And that challenge was based on an argument that the mixed contract test wasn't met. And so what happened? So the panel looked at it, and interestingly, they said that they didn't even need to look at the mixed contracts test, and they were happy that not only the orthotics but the wheelchair element was actually a pure relevant health service and therefore fully covered by the PSR. And the features that pointed them to that conclusion were these. So particularly the service specification for the wheelchairs, the way that there was a clinical pathway for patients, the way that the wheelchairs were made bespoke to the clinical needs of a patient. It wasn't just a supply of a product, all supported the view that it was a healthcare service. It was true that there wasn't a requirement for CQC registration to provide the wheelchairs, but that didn't automatically mean, on the facts of this case, that it couldn't be a healthcare service. And it wasn't necessary to look at the relative expenditure on clinical services and other goods and services in the wheelchair element, because we weren't sort of going into the mixed contracts test. So I think what that shows, the moral of the story, if you like, is that the panel does seem to be willing to take quite a purposive and in the round view of the definition of healthcare services for the purposes of the PSR, and to really look at sort of what is actually happening on the ground. And the other point of interest here, I think, in relation to mixed contracts is that I think the more technologically sophisticated the provision of healthcare becomes, I think the greater the scope for mixed contracts could potentially be, particularly mixtures of sort of healthcare and IT services. So that would be really interesting to see where that goes. And I think, and good timing, it is 10:30, so I think we should draw to a close. Let you all get on with your day. Do let us have your feedback. You should get a form popping up at the end of the webinar. And as I said, do look out for the recording, the slides and the Q&A document, which we will circulate ASAP. And on our next 5 in 25, I think we'll be returning to the Act for an overview of how it's all going and talking about any particular tricky issues that are emerging. So that's it for now. Big thank you from Shailee, Nathalia, and from me. Thanks for joining us. Good luck with those pipeline notices, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.